Hey everybody, thank you for zooming in for this taster session. My name's Stephen Murphy. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of History of Art and Archaeology. My position or my role is I mainly teach about museums and curating. I also have a subject specialist area, like most of us or all of us in the department will focus on specific regions, and obviously being SOAS, they are usually Asia, Africa, or Middle East based. So for myself, I focus mainly on Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Malaysia, and Singapore to a certain extent. So that's my geographical focus. But today, what I really wanted to do was to give you a talk, just to give you a sort of idea of some of the questions that we raise and the theoretical outlooks that we take in the department in terms of history of art and archaeology in particular. And I'm going to do it through the lens of the museum and go through it with you. The title, Museums Are Not Neutral, you may have heard this phrase. It's become much more prominent in the last maybe 5 years in particular. When we think of a lot of the public debate around museums and so forth. Somebody's in the chat. Okay, that's Kimberly, great. Yeah, a lot of the public debate, a lot of the social justice activism, a lot of debates that are happening, questioning this idea of museum neutrality. And I'm going to use that as a lens or an entry point to, talk about how museums function and how they display art, and that in turn really factors into how we think about art history or archaeology as well, how we reconstruct past cultures, or how we think about how we come up with artistic canon, if you know, historical canon or styles and artistic movements, very much tied up with also how museums display objects or display artwork. So that's sort of the general overview. And yeah, feel free to ask questions as we go along. I have a few sort of interactive things to do along the way. Yeah, that's actually what I'm talking about. What are museums? Let's you think about that for a moment. It's not as straightforward maybe as we may think. And then I'll look at architecture and museum layout, and how actually that it's probably quite subconsciously for most people. Maybe they're not aware of how that actually shapes how you view objects, or how you start thinking about and behaving within museum spaces. And then we look at something called a museum effect, which you probably are familiar with, but not in terms of this phrase. It's the idea that once you place anything within a gallery or within a museum, within a showcase, it transforms the meaning of that object, and it becomes a work of art, just by methods of display, or by its how do we put it? By basically just placing it within a museum, it can have this transformative effect, for positive or negative reasons. So we'll look at that. Yeah, a little bit more about myself, just so you maybe get an idea. Like I say, I look at Southeast Asia. I did my MA and PhD at SOAS. I did my BA in Trinity College Dublin, which is where I'm from. And I started off, I studied archaeology. That's where I started. My undergraduate was archaeology and ancient history, and more Greco-Roman world is what I started out. And then I shifted in my what we call postgraduate years, so MA and PhD, to look more at Asian archaeology. So that's how I started out. And then I after my PhD, I was fortunate enough to work in museums as a curator for about 9 years. And then I came back to SOAS a year and a half ago. So I've been here. So now I teach and research on museums, and I'm still active in archaeology. So maybe just that gives you a bit of a sense of what we do as staff, or our career paths to how we got to where we are. I know you're all starting out thinking about what degrees you want to take. So yeah, that's how I got to where I was. I wanted to start though, just to really quickly, you can put this in the chat. Yeah, think about actually, what was the last museum you visited? I know with COVID, that's been maybe more restricted, or have you looked at a museum online on a virtual visit as well? So maybe we can start with that first. If you want to put in the chat the last museum or gallery that you visited, it'd be interested to see. And what type of words would you describe? How would you describe that museum? Great. Barber Institute in Birmingham. Thank you. I'm not familiar with that. Lena, what type of art or what type of objects do they display there? That's interesting. Okay, Art Gallery of South Australia. I was there a long, long time ago. Yeah, that's a very nice museum, actually. Oh, okay. Raphaelite artwork. Okay, interesting. Thank you. So yeah, so the Barber Institute then I would say is we would call it an art museum. Or anyone else want to add in anything? You're more than welcome to unmute yourself as well if you want to make a comment or raise your hand and talk about it. No other takers. All right, great. So we have two at least. Yeah. So there are two different. The art gallery of art. So there's two art museums you've both been to. Yeah, interesting. We can think about the other questions as well about what type of objects we're on display. Oh, great. We've got one more. Great. Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. A storybook you can walk through. Yeah. In museums, as curators, we talk a lot about narrative, about the museum narrative. What type of story, what type of narrative are we trying to tell? And that's really a really important way of conceptualizing how to then actuate it in displays. So yeah, that's great that you see it and think of it in that way. Yeah, and we'll look at that today in terms of how architecture plays in. Yeah, great. The Ashmolean in Oxford. Yeah, I've been there a few times recently. What type of objects do they, how would you describe the Ashmolean? What type of museum is that? Is it an art museum? Is it an archaeology museum? Is it a natural history museum? Or what type of stories does it tell? Or even what you could think of one object that you remember. Yeah, lots of art, some ancient Greek artifacts and statues. Yeah, that's a good summation of the Ashmolean. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the Ashmolean is what we refer to as an encyclopedic museum, like the British Museum as well, where they try and represent sort of world cultures or different civilizations through time, and they do that, yeah, through many different obviously having galleries based around different cultures and civilizations. Great. Okay, I'm going to move on, but you can keep putting things in the chat if you like. It's really helpful. Yeah, what are museums? It's not as straightforward, when we start to drill down into how we actually define them. But you may be familiar with ICOM, or you may not. It's called the International Council of Museums, and this is a non-governmental organization that it's the largest, I think, museum professional body, international museum professional body that most of the major museums are members of, and they come up with definitions on quite every 10-15 years they review and revise them. So it's quite interesting when you track the different definitions, you can see how the concept of museums change over time. But the present definition is a museum is a non-profit permanent institution in service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purpose of education, study, and enjoyment. Yeah, quite a lot going on in that I won't unpack it all today, but some of the main aspects, of course, is acquires, conserves, research, communicates, I guess, it's telling stories. Yeah, and so education comes before enjoyment, apparently, according to ICOM. But at least they put them together. Yeah, there's been a lot of debate about how museums function has changed over time. Sometimes we can think about it as a temple versus a forum. When museums first started out, and up until about the 1960s, really, there was this idea that museums functioned similar to temples, as in they were authorities, they were unquestionable authorities. What you saw in a museum, the narratives that they told were the sort of authoritative narratives. And there weren't really places for debate, which was a forum. But this has changed particularly over the past 30 years, where museums are becoming more spaces of discussion, debate, and of course, in more recent times, contestation, ideas about who has the right to, whose story should be told, who should tell those stories, what type of interpretations of those stories should be brought to the fore. So we've seen this movement sort of take off over the past 20, 30 years. Another scholar, Marstein, has 4 definitions. The shrine is very much the same concept as a temple, but she's also pointed out that over the past 20, 30 years as well, museums have become more commercialized, more market driven. There's more of a need to generate revenue, even if they're public institutions such as the British Museum or the V&A. They still need income. They don't make profit. They're not there to make profit, but they need income to function, and they need income to develop. Something we're hearing much more of these days, of course, is museums as colonizing spaces. They do have a lot of their collections. If you think back to the Ashmolean, for example, and a lot of the collections were from colonial British colonies, previous British colonies. So there's this, obviously with the British Museum as well, we have debates such as the Benin bronzes, or of course the Parthenon marbles. So that museums are still in some ways reenacting or still perpetuating these colonial power structures by possessing objects from different cultures that used to be previous colonies, and not repatriating them. The idea of a post-museum is a bit more complex. I won't get into it today, but I wanted just to run through that as well, to give you an idea of some of the sort of literature that we do when we give these courses. Usually I would assign this reading beforehand to my class, and we would then discuss it. Yeah, I wonder if you can put this in the chat as well, if the museums that you've been to, some of the ones, yeah, how would you describe them? For example, the Barber Institute in Birmingham. I wonder how you would, do any of these definitions? Does it fit any of them? Or the Ashmolean, does it fit? What else? Art Gallery of South Australia. They can be more than one of these definitions, of course, as well, right? Sometimes they can function like shrines, but also be a colonizing space or a market-driven industry. All right, I'll again, you can put that in the chat as I go along if it comes to mind. I'll keep going. But I wanted to look at sort of museum architecture as well. Okay, forum and a colonizing space. That would be Art Gallery of South Australia. Interesting. Yeah, good. Yeah, museum architecture. The museums as we know them today, the sort of modern museum, really takes off in the 18th, 19th century. And you may have noticed this, that a lot of them emulate architecture, other architectural forms, such as temples, shrines, and cathedrals. So it's not just the way that museums operate or the narratives that they tell, but also the very structures of them that can also reinforce these ideologies, or these ways of what we call producing knowledge. Yeah, and the placement of the galleries is a very clear way of showing this. It can reflect, what they prioritize, what ideologies. And a very easy and straightforward example, for example, in the British Museum, the African gallery is in the basement. So, what does that say, right? What type of messaging does that send, that, when you walk in, what you see is Greek and Roman art or Egyptian art or Western art, but African art is in the basement. We'll look more at that as we go along. The architecture can, emulate very clearly the Greco-Roman temple. So this is Philadelphia. Great. The Barber Institute as a shrine for Birmingham students. Thank you. That's a communal space for local students, as it is a concert hall as well as an art gallery. Great, that's just really interesting. Thank you, Lena. And Australia, yeah, great. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, if you think of settler colonialism, yeah, and most non-Indigenous galleries would be considered colonizing spaces, particularly as most still in art. Yeah, we do talk about obviously issues of art and loot and yeah, theft of art in the courses that we teach. That's something at the forefront as well of what we do. I won't, obviously for time, I won't get into it today, but yeah, definitely. Thank you for highlighting that. Yeah, this is just a quick example. This is Philadelphia Art Museum. It looks very similar to this Greco-Roman temple in France. You can think of the British Museum, of course, as well, with its monumental facade. Some go for more church architecture or for Gothic Romanesque, but the result's kind of the same, right? This is the V&A, and this is Strasbourg Cathedral. You can see it's more in the here. It's more in the Gothic style entranceway, but also in the type of architecture. Natural History Museum London is very interesting because, yeah, it looks like a kind of giant cathedral, which may seem strange to us today when we think of natural history. We think of science and religion as separated, right, in modern terms. But when this museum was set up in the 19th century, it still wasn't the case. There was still this idea that that man or humans were the sort of highest level on the evolutionary scale, and that this is a sort of Christian principle of the organization of nature. And the museum, when it was first set up, followed those type of evolutionist ideas of Charles Darwin, obviously, but from quite a Christian framework. Obviously today when you go there, that's not so much the case, but the structure is still the same. So it's quite an interesting juxtaposition. This is another scholar, Goebbelshausen, who she talks quite a bit about it. So, and you also see it in other parts of the world. This is a museum I'm very familiar with. This is National Museum Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and here they've based it on a temple, and a Buddhist temple architecture. So you see this type of process happening in different ways. And yeah, let me read this quote because we'll sort of go through it. Yeah, Carol Duncan is another sort of important scholar that looks at museums, and yeah, she way back in 30 years ago, she already was one of the first people to point out that a museum is not neutral. It's not a transparent sheltering space that is often claimed to be. 30 years ago, that was still very much the idea, right? Now we see much more challenges to that proposition. More like the traditional ceremonial monuments that museum buildings frequently emulate: classical temples, medieval cathedrals, Renaissance palaces. We've just looked at a few of them. The museum is a complex experience involving architecture, programmed display of objects, and highly rationalized installation practices. Yeah, this idea of a programmed display of objects, we'll look at that now, and I'll show you some examples of what I mean. This is another very famous museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in San Francisco, in New York. Yeah, which I'm sure some of you may be familiar with. And what's really interesting is when we look at the ground plan again, we can start to see where their priorities lie in terms of which art they think is more important than others. So for example, when you walk in, you walk into this grand hall. Some of you may be familiar with the grand staircase from the Met Gala, which they have every year with lots of celebrities. This is where usually the photographs are being taken. But for our purposes, we're not. But again, that gets back to the market-driven industry aspect of museums for sure, on a very, celebrity A-list scale. But yeah, what is interesting is when you enter this museum, you have three options. You can go left, you can go right, or you can go up the stairs. And even if you want to get to other cultures, you have to follow one of those routes. So this is what we mean by sort of carefully programmed routes or programmed displays of art. So for example, if you go left, you get into this gallery. Do you know what civilization or culture is being displayed here? It should be quite easy. You can look at the architecture as well. Oops, sorry, I jumped ahead. Any takers on what this is? Yeah, Greco-Roman, absolutely. So again, one of the first things you see when you go into the museum, if you go left, is Western civilization, right? Western art. If you go right, you get into this. This one's too easy. Obviously, it's Egyptian. So again, you can see the setup, right? And then if you go upstairs, what is this? What type of art would we call this? Yeah, Renaissance. Good. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, great. Yeah, so you can see straight away, right, that you have Greek and Roman on the two wings, and then you literally ascend up to European Renaissance. So we can see from this, most visitors may not consciously realize this, that the layout actually determines, how they maybe subconsciously view art, but it's very clear. Or if you're the general visitor that is not wanting to see a specific gallery, you will end up in one of these three galleries first. And even if you think of it, that's probably where most of your attention is going to be, because the longer you stay in the museum, your attention span drops, obviously, and you get tired, and you may not make it all the way to the back to this last little gallery. So again, it's very clear. Does anyone know what this is? This is more difficult to what type of art would you think is on display here? Yeah, okay, Kenyan, that's a good estimation. Anyone else? It's close. Yeah, it's what's interesting with this gallery is it's not just one specific country, actually. West African, Zimbabwe. Great. Yeah, so you're all thinking African art. That's good. Yeah, it is. It's African art, but it's also what's interesting. Again, it talks about this is the Michael C. Rockefeller wing. He was a very wealthy American philanthropist. And what they've done in this wing is they've grouped a lot of what they would classify as ethnographic art. So it has, sub-Saharan Africa, but it also has Pacific Islands, North, Central, and South America. So what they've done is they've combined different cultures into this one gallery. And again, we could question why, Greek and Roman, Egyptian, European get their own galleries, and why art from other parts of the world gets sort of bundled in together in this more ethnographic display. So again, you can see from even And this, to get to this gallery, you have to go through the Greco-Roman gallery. So again, you're already, you know, even if you just wander through the Greco-Roman gallery, just even by doing that, you're already, you know, have that sort of, you've already walked through and seen Greek and Roman art, and then you will inevitably sort of compare it with what you're seeing now. So again, these type of strategies show which type of arts museums prioritize over others. Does anybody know what we call this type of display? We're jumping ahead in time. This is another very common museum display. Maze-like, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sometimes museums are mazes, right? You get lost in them, like these giant department stores they build these days, or malls, shopping malls. What about the walls? What color are the walls? That's always a clue. This is obviously modern art. So yeah, we call this formation the white cube. You may have heard of it. Yeah, white walled installation, open roof. So yeah, the white cube is a form of architecture that developed in the 1930s onwards, and it's very prominent today. Most museums that you go to, if it's showing modern or contemporary art, this is the type of architecture they use. And you can see it's very clean. It's like kind of sealed off from the outside world. And many visitors think this is neutral, right? You just go and you're looking at the art and it's not really influencing you. But again, there's been a lot of critique about it. Yeah, the court hold is a perfect example. That is a very good, yeah, a very good example. The court hold is very much, you know, very traditional art history in this sense, yeah. But yeah, the idea is that you seal off the outside world, right? That you create this space where it's just you and the work of art. So it's an interesting concept, but it strips out all the context, right? It strips out all the sort of social and political meaning that maybe an artwork has, particularly if you hang it just on a wall. So it has been critiqued from that point of view as well. This is MoMA, Museum of Modern Art. These are Monet's, as I'm sure you're all, yeah. And it promotes something that we call pure formalism. You can only really look at the object or the work of art in front of you from a stylistic or what we say an aesthetic point of view, because they don't give any context about the artist. Sometimes they do, but very little, or the social or political context within this work of art was made. So again, it really focuses and channels your attention. And of course, the other thing that it does is this is where it functions, you know, quite like a museum or like a shrine, is that, you know, there's a social code that we all, you know, instinctively adhere to, you know, no talking, no eating, no running, no sleeping. You know, we talk in hushed voices in these type of galleries as well. So you're only meant to experience the art. So again, it's a very, the architecture itself and the means of display invokes what Carl Duncan would call a ritualized form of behavior. So quite similar to when you go into a religious space, and it promotes, for better or for worse, you know, it's not always a negative thing, but it does promote a certain way of seeing and a certain way of understanding. So. Yeah, and then to look from the architecture to the actual objects themselves. So then once you place them in galleries, once you place something in a gallery, it has what we call the museum effect, where it turns, you know, objects into works of art. So even if the object, if we think back to the Rockefeller Gallery of the sub-Saharan African art and so forth, a lot of those objects may have not been created as artworks. They may be religious items. Same with the Greek and Roman as well, right? The sculpture of Apollo or something. They were originally meant to be placed in temples. So what you have when you put something in a museum is that it transforms its meaning into a work of art. It becomes something different than what it was originally intended to be. And we call this the museum effect. So this is quite a good example of, you know, for one of these I, yeah, I've forgotten what you call them. Oh my God, sorry. The sorry, Easter Island, right? The heads from Easter Island, for example, placed in a museum on a plinth like this, it becomes a work of art, right? In our modern or contemporary viewpoint, but obviously its original purpose was not this African piece here at the same gallery in the Metropolitan Museum. Again, it was not a work of art. It's not created as a work of art. It's a religious figure. So the use of plinths, of pedestals, of spotlighting, all of these techniques transform the object, and even the way the object label is written does this as well. So this is an example from a museum I used to work in. So yeah, you can see this is a schematic done up by the designers. So this is the plinth, this is the spotlighting, and so forth. This is the actual object. And then even the, this type of format of how we write museum labels, all combines to create this idea of turning an object into a work of art. Oops. Yeah, and again, the other thing that I, of course, is that 90% of museum collections are in storage. So even the selection, even before we get to, placing things in a gallery or how the architecture affects our ways of viewing, the object selection, determines a lot even before that, because, what curators choose to display, and maybe more importantly, what they choose not to display, functions as, defines to a lot of extent how we understand the past. Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm not familiar with that. Thank you. So yeah, that's another idea. And here again, you can see this very clear museum effect. This is a fish tank. This is like something you would put your goldfish in the 18th century China, but today it's in a museum. So. But what's interesting is artists have started to play with this as well and started to subvert it. And one of the first artists to do this was Fred Wilson back in the 1980s and into the 90s. And it's interesting because when you see artists do that, then it really sort of emphasizes a lot of the issues that we've been looking at today. So he started playing around with museum architecture, and he did an exhibition where he had 3 separate rooms. So one was like a turn of the century salon. So like the way the art was hung in the Renaissance gallery at the Met, that's what we call a salon hang. Then he did up another room as a modernist white box, and then he did another as an ethnographic. And then he displayed the work of 30 contemporary artists, each divided into these 3 rooms. And the way people looked at the art was different depending on the room he put it in. So yeah, so for example, he says, when I placed the work in an ethnographic space, I would have visiting curators say with some surprise, "Oh, you have a collection of primitive art." And I had to tell the one curator, "No, Valerie, that work you're staring at was in your gallery a month ago." The environment really changed the work. So yeah, it's very, so what he's done is very clever by putting it in a display case that looks like it's ethnographic. He even managed to trick the curator that, into thinking that a work of contemporary art is an ethnographic piece. And then he did other things. So he took French and British flags and wrapped them around African masks, and so forth. So yeah, very clever way of manipulating museum space. He then continued with another show called Mining the Museum. This is a real sort of benchmark in anyone who studies museology or museums always refers back to this, because again, he was the first person to really disrupt sort of museum displays by using display technique, by using the museum's techniques and kind of, yeah, and turning it back on itself. And he says the museum becomes the medium. So one of the things he did, so basically sorry, I should go back first. This Maryland Historical Society was quite a conservative historical society in obviously Maryland in the United States. And they gave him free reign, free access to all of their collections so he could come up with new displays. And what he did is he started going through and placing things in sort of unusual circumstances. So this is one of his famous ones. So he calls this metalwork. So can you tell what these are? Can you see what the picture's a bit grainy, unfortunately, because this show was done 30 years ago. I realize we're running out of time. Yeah, maybe it's not perfectly clear. Yeah, great. Yeah, brilliant. Shackles, exactly. So he managed to find in the museum collection shackles that would have been used, obviously, I think during the period of before abolition. So during the period of slavery in the United States, and he places them within this showcase with all this wealthy silverware, and he calls it metalwork. So again, he really disrupts museum, because museums like to put things into showcases depending on their type of material. So, but by doing that and placing the shackles in there, he starts to bring out a lot of narratives about slavery in Maryland and how it's reflected in the collection, and so forth. And he does this through many different types of display, and this is just one of the most prominent ones. Yeah, and what he says, all this denial, all this history of America, all this history of Europe, and the relationships between people is not being talked about. Museums just pretend that we can overlook it, that we can experience culture without having those feelings of oppression. This compounds those feelings. That's why I like working in museums, because they're so much of America to me unconsciously. Yeah, so what he does is go through the collections and show the sort of historical contradictions within them. Yeah, I'm just going to finish up with another famous, well-known contemporary artist, Maurizio Catalan, and he does a lot as well with, he actually will incorporate architecture into his artworks, and this is one of his most famous La Nonna Ora, where Pope John Paul, a wax replica or wax model of Pope John Paul II, is struck by a meteorite, and he places it in a gallery and so forth. So it's an installation that works with the architecture. Yeah, and then he starts placing it in different locations in different museums. So this one's very interesting because obviously, if you look at this very traditional salon hang again, it's a lot of Renaissance Christian religious art. That, of course, at the time when it was painted, was really, a lot of the patrons would have been the church or wealthy churches, and it's there to edify and glorify, the Catholic religion, essentially. But by placing, Pope John Paul II in that gallery, it straight away creates this juxtaposition where it starts to challenge the artworks within that space. It challenges the viewer to start thinking about, questions about maybe Christianity or Catholicism in particular. You may just be surprised to see, Pope John Paul struck down by a meteorite. What does that mean, and so forth. So again, it's a very clever way of using the display, the existing displays in museums, and subverting them, raising lots of questions in the viewer's mind. Of course, some people were very offended by this, particularly some more conservative elements of Polish society. But I think that's kind of Maurizio's point as well. The very last example is the Guggenheim, which you may be familiar with in New York. It's this very interesting architectural space that works as a spiral. So again, a lot of what the Guggenheim do is retrospectives, which is the life history of an artist. And because of the shape of the museum, it's better. It lends itself to this sort of chronological display because the viewer has to go up in a spiral. So again, the display kind of limits what the curator can do in terms of telling a story or the narrative they want to tell. in terms of the artwork or the artist. And they wanted to do a retrospective on Maurizio Catalan, and he really refused to, you know, he didn't want to follow this linear idea of an artist, you know, that you can trace an artist from sort of early period to middle period to late period, as if it's some kind of clear, what we call a teleological development, that, you know, there's a sort of clear progression, which we do, of course, with most artists, right? Whereas, you know, the artist's life themselves might have been kind of, doesn't go in a straight line, right? It could have been all kinds of diversions and sort of peaks and troughs in it. So what he came up with instead was he insisted that they create this rigging, and then he hung all of his different artworks at different levels vertically. So basically you can walk, as you walked up, you would see different artworks from different angles, and it was really a fascinating and a really quite revolutionary way of doing it, and again of subverting the museum architecture. Yeah, there's a short video, but hold on, we'll probably run out of time. You can, if you want, you can watch it on YouTube. And yeah, so I just will finish up. I think hopefully today I gave you an idea that, you know, museums function in many different ways. There's many different types of museums. They can be shrines or temples. They can act like forums, which is more of a, I guess, what Maurizio Catalan was doing, placing his artwork of Pope John Paul, makes it a site of discussion instead of a temple, which the gallery itself looked like. They can be colonizing spaces, that's issues that Fred Wilson definitely deals with, market industry and so forth. The architecture frames our modes of interpretation, the way we think, and the way the museums produce meaning. We cannot really escape that. We can subvert it in ways, but it's always there. The museum effect further shapes and frames how we look at art or look at objects. Yeah, and artists and curators have been looking at ways to move around with this. Yeah, and then this T-shirt, if you want to, in about 2015, this activist in the States started, yeah, kind of making these T-shirts and so forth, and taking this kind of rallying cry of museums are not neutral a step further. So yeah, that's it for today. I hope you found it helpful. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments, happy to answer them or try to answer them. You know, oh, you are there.
Maybe whilst we have questions coming in, have people have time to drop them in. I mean, would you say, in your experience, Stephen, in terms of museums and experiences museums around the world, would you say that there's any particular examples of where you have a very different kind of experience to maybe Western museums and a very kind of not so much quiet or considered kind of walk around and take in the art? Would you say that there are any examples of maybe museums, galleries elsewhere in the world where it's a lot more in terms of discussion points and people moving around? I'm just trying to think. I've been to a number of, they would probably be more like UNESCO World Heritage sites necessarily than kind of galleries, particularly across India, where I almost feel like my experience of going around those sites and seeing kind of seeing statues and pieces of art in situ, almost my experience has been kind of one of hearing all of the voices around me, different people, different generations, and kind of that aspect as much as seeing the art itself. So I just wondered if you had any examples of that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, the interesting thing with museums as well is that the sort of Western model or template of museums sort of then got perpetuated, particularly in somewhere like India, which of course was a colony. So a lot of the museums, but even in post-independent countries, when they would set up national museums, and they would always follow the Western model, which, so again, it's a bit problematic, right? That we sort of, and this leads to a lot of issues. And there is an example, I think, from Zimbabwe, where post-independence, none of the local community was coming to the museum because it was set up by the white colonialists for essentially white colonists, and so what they were displaying and how they were displaying it was completely meaningless to the average Zimbabwean. Is that, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but the director. So what they did is they started to bring in a lot of sort of cultural aspects. So to try and bring the museum to life, right? So they started doing, I think, like cookery demonstrations, and they started doing much more intangible forms of art, like dance and music and so forth. And that started to bring, the general population in. And so they're one of the good examples of how they've switched it and over time managed to develop that museum so it became something, relevant for the actual population. So you do see it. Yeah, India is interesting as well, because I remember being at Sarnath, which is this famous Buddhist site, and the museum has all the Buddhist sculpture, as Buddhist and Hindu sculpture lined up, and you get a lot of pilgrims there now, a lot of religious Buddhist pilgrims, and there was this group of, I think, Chinese Buddhist monks turned up, and they walked in and they went around and they bowed in front of every single statue. And so for them, they were religious objects, right? Even though they were in a museum space, they were not looking at them as works of art. And they even, bowed in front of the Hindu objects. So they didn't even make that. So it's very interesting to see, obviously, in different locations and different circumstances. Yeah. Absolutely. There's a question from Nina. Yeah, I should have said that. Absolutely. We build in museum visits from into our course. So actually, one of the visits we did this year was to the Ashmolean. We did a day trip. We went to the Ashmolean and the Pitt Rivers together, and we looked at both of those museums. SOAS is literally right behind the British Museum, so we're very lucky in that sense. So I take students to that regularly. So depending on the course, and other lecturers as well, even if they're not teaching on museology per se, but say if they're giving a course on African art or Indian art, whatever, they will usually use the British Museum or one of the other museums to do these visits. So absolutely. And it's something we're trying to build in more. And sometimes we also get the curators to come and give talks as well. So you hear firsthand from museum professionals. So.
Yeah, and I think across the board, there's a lot of opportunities with other departments as well to kind of experience, again, kind of looking at particular subjects through art. So I know that in a lot of our anthropology department, they have a lot of migration and diaspora kind of topics that are covered through art themselves. So there's definitely something you can experience throughout your program at SOAS, and even in open modules.
Great. Sarah's got a good question. Yeah. How do you think museums and the lack of neutrality in museums reflect art which depicts gender and sexuality by artists with diverse genders and sexualities? Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the major issues, of course, within museums about how to represent, how museums do or do not represent gender. And I think this is, it's one of the very clear ways to show that museums are not neutral spaces, right? If you look at the sort of gender norms that are reinforced. You may be familiar with the Guerrilla Girls. They're a group of activists in New York, and they have a website. And if you go into their website, it's really clever. Like they went around I think the Metropolitan Museum, for example, and they counted how many male artists were on display versus female artists, but then they also compared that with how many male artists works were on display versus female nudes within the artworks. And of course the numbers are ridiculous, right? Something like 3,000 male artists or 3,000 artworks by male artists and something like 100 by women, but there's something like 3,000 images of nude women. So, you know, these type of ways are very effective in showing that. Museums in general, it depends on the museum, right? There's been, the Brooklyn Museum have set up a center there for feminist art. So they actually have a specific center that focuses purely on that. But as you'll notice, yeah, a lot of the bigger museums, they don't even really tackle this head on. So that's definitely one of the major issues that museums are struggling with. I mean, the Met did a big exhibition called Camp, Notes on Fashion, about 4 years ago, where they looked at camp as a concept, but within the fashion world. And again, it was clear that the curator was trying to get in, you know, ideas of diverse sexuality and gender and represent it through different fashion designers or different ways of dress over time. But again, you know, I think he still didn't explicitly make the show about gender and diverse gender. So he still skirts it a little bit. So you can see even there that museums are still, you know, somewhat hesitant in dealing with those issues. But yeah, it definitely reflects, right? I think you can see it.
So we probably have time for one more question. If anybody's got one more that they'd like to pop in, do feel free. We have just a little bit more time left. If not, we can also end it there. I mean, there's probably been a lot of food for thought in this presentation, and a lot to go away and kind of think about, and maybe even just going through your experiences and, you know, your interaction with different spaces and museums and galleries and UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and even maybe what you before didn't consider to be a museum, which you now consider to be a museum, but also just thinking like the way in which you navigate that museum and kind of the way it's set out for you. I think after today's presentation, we're definitely all thinking differently about how we go through a museum, and whether when we're going through a museum, we're actually always picking out which particular exhibitions we go to, or whether that's kind of subliminally
funneled in certain directions. Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for attending today's session, and thank you very much, Stephen, for the session. I think it's been really, really interesting and definitely a lot of food for thought that I'll be taking away. And we hope that these sessions are really helpful just in terms of kind of opening you up to some of the areas that you're going to look at SOAS. But again, this is one of many, many different parts of the programme that you will consider if you decide to study with us.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for everyone for their great comments and taking part as well. Yeah, I learned some new museums as well. It's always interesting to hear about different museums people have been to. So yeah, and I hope that just makes you think a little bit differently, maybe, or has primed you a bit now for next visit. So.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. All right.